Well, good afternoon, everybody who's taken the commodity line that's available to you today. And we've got a follow-on from an earlier session, which took a lot of time out of the afternoon, so I hope we can do justice to it. What we actually want to try and do is to put things into a context. You've heard about the voluntary initiatives, and now we're going to talk about the limits, perhaps, to those. This is in the context of leading corporate CSR participants like Paul Pullman of Unilever, identifying that there are actually limits to the business can fix everything perspective. So this is an ideal moment to try and create a collective model of change. And actually, today's panelists are really well equipped to help us do that. But first, I wanted to ask you in the room, is anybody involved in supply chain work here? Okay, that's good. Does anybody buy anything? No? Oh, one person buys things. Okay, all right. So we have quite a lot of observers in the process, but not many doers. So we want to try and share the experience that we have of this process. So we have 4 speakers here today who bring decades of practical experience in taking policy interventions and turning them into life. And in order of their intervention, and I have to be clear that this is a representative supra-governmental activity. We have Julia Torta from the European Commission, who comes with so much experience of taking the helicopter view and piloting their way through a clear path between the interests of so many stakeholders. Then as a representative of the policy community, we have Duncan Brack, who has many years' experience of Chatham House and building awareness and consensus, and has worked directly and indirectly with politicians in and outside of government. And as a representative of the private sector, we have Rachel Butler, who's an independent advisor to the European Timber Trades Federation and brings her long experience of that sector's journey to our collective understanding. We've also got a representative from civil society with Silas Saikar, who through his work on the VPA for Liberia has much to share with us on bridge building required between the good intentions and the actual experience of those in the forest and at community level. And he has a lot to add to this discussion. And the reason we're here now is that we're a really special place in human history, because our choices as a species can be seen objectively on the face of the planet, and now crucially in real time. The conversion of natural forests into land for agriculture, we can see from space, continues unchecked, and the recent recent coverage of the haze in Indonesia and gave us the ability to report impacts. And it shows us what information systems are available to us, and then it asks us some questions as to what we're going to do with that knowledge set. So we've got a new perspective, and hopefully we can use that wisely to live in better harmony with the natural world, which is why you're all here. But nowhere in those choices that we make is it more difficult than in the area of agriculture. Because we need to know much more than we do now about the actual consumption of commodities that are so fundamental to daily life. This morning I was thinking about this session, and I thought about how to connect us to these choices, and I looked at my breakfast, I looked in the bathroom cabinet, and I thought about all the products that I was consuming which directly impact on those commodity markets, or were impacted by the commodity markets. And I don't know, as an expert, if it's sustainable. So how the hell the world out there is supposed to do that is something that we need to think about. I can put my faith in the brands, and we've heard eloquently from one of the global brands today about what they're trying to do. But my question is, will they do it in time? So this panel is thinking about not just who, but the how and the when, and is it going to be quick enough? And that's what we need to talk about today. I need to work through and come up with some solutions today for what is probably the biggest problem that we have on the planet. And we've been trying to do this for a long time. I'm here because I've got 25 years experience of doing this in commodity markets. And we need to work beyond the voluntary control mechanisms that we've all spent so long trying to create, because we've heard there are constraints and they're not working as fast as we would like them to. But let's be clear what we're actually dealing with here. We're actually talking about refashioning a cornerstone of the modern world. The whole point about commodity markets is that they produce, without any identification of place of origin, materials to be consumed. And they make available to millions of users at the lowest possible cost those commodities. And that cost benefit versus the lack of attributable place of origin is a major part of the commodity markets. So interchangeability is crucial to the price equation. And if we change that price equation by asking traders and others to do more work, and we've heard about segregation and what that means, it creates fluctuations in cost, which somebody has to pay. So if we change those models without thought, we will have an impact on food security and the prices that people pay. And a lot of intelligent people have pointed out that the Arab Spring had quite a bit to do with politics, but it also had quite a bit to do with bread prices. So we have to think about what does that mean in the world. So it can't be a niche activity if we're going to achieve sustainability when it comes to commodities. It has to be something that happens overall. And the model where we have, at best, 40, at worst, less than 10% certified in markets is not a viable proposition to roll out elsewhere. So we need to move with cooperation and to move globally to a different position. So how do we mainstream that? We've heard a bit in the conversation about premium prices, that there isn't an overwhelming rush to pay more, surprisingly. Producers, traders, and consumers are finding it difficult to justify paying more for the improvements to maintain biodiversity and to provide transparency. So we have to think about what that means. So this afternoon we're going to talk about what's possible, and we're going to talk about what works and what works hopefully really fast. So the reason I'm here is because I have a lot of personal history in this struggle, having worked with voluntary initiatives, helping the FSC in the early days, worked on chain of custody and product claims control process in the RSPO and disputes and other things. I won't bore you with the whole details. But I do a lot of work with brands and retailers actually on tracking their supply chains and the challenges in the real world that's involved in that. And when you're re-engineering supply lines, we're talking about lots and lots of actors that need to be convinced. So I've got a few battle scars, and I can tell you what I've learnt, that none of this is easy, and that I'm painfully aware that it's taken far too long to get not as far as I would like. So if we're going to keep the forest origin the forests upright rather than shredded, we need to be much better at what we're doing. So we need to learn from the experience of the past and then expand those lessons and roll them out much, much faster. So we need to hear from the experience of everybody today and work through that process. And after the last session, where I didn't feel the floor got enough time to ask the questions, because there's as much expertise out there as there is in here, we're going to go to a Q&A much earlier on in the process. So what the planning is to give everybody a chance to tell you why they're here and what their expertise is. And we're going to do that in 10-minute blocks, so bear with us. The important bit is these people have a lot of experience to bring to the process from other commodities, and if you can assimilate that information, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So first, I'm going to ask Juliana Tortilla to start the session for us, and like everybody, she's going to have 10 minutes, so we'll keep to that. You have the mic, yeah?
Thank you, Liz, and thanks to all participants for being with us this afternoon. I think this session built on what has been said already, so I'll try also in my introduction to take some inspiration for what has been said by our predecessors here. There were some calls for political commitment, and this clearly has to come from governments and from regulatory bodies. I work for the European Commission. As you know, the European Commission has a role in lawmaking, but also in supervision of laws. And of course, we work in collaboration and in constant coordination with the Parliament and the Member States. And whenever a law is born, is because you had a long process of consultation with all stakeholders. So that's, for us, it's an important moment because in relation to deforestation and the supply chains and the drivers of deforestation is a period of reflection of what to do in the coming years. And I would like to recall what we have already as political commitment, because many of the things that have been referred to today actually could be already accommodated in existing legislation that we have at European Union level. The problem is that we have so much legislation that sometimes either we forget or we are not aware, and we need sometimes to make some kind of screening to see where the legislation needs to be improved more than new legislation created. In 2008, we issued a communication. It's a communication that set the objectives of the EU in relation to deforestation. And the objectives, as I can read, and you can find them in the communication, I think it's one of the documents that has been uploaded on the website of this conference, was to halt global forest loss by 2030 at the latest, and to reduce gross tropical deforestation by at least 50% by 2020. Compared to current levels. So these are ambitious targets and they still remain. The issue is that what we have been doing since 2008 and what we are planning to do to reach the targets by 2020 and 2030. There is another piece of policy that you need to be aware is already existing, which is a so-called resource efficiency roadmap. The name is already self-explanatory, and what is interesting is that the strategy and the vision there targets 2050. So there is a vision going much beyond these objectives of halting deforestation by 2030, and some more concrete actions or some ideas for policy development that have the deadline at 2020. And of course, if we have to quote our flagship commodity is flagged, and it's not a kind of game of words. You know that we have the FLAG action plan since 2003. FLAG stands for Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. And it is an example of how you can combine in a piece of policy, in this case an action plan, supply and demand side measures. There are some discussion if this action plan could provide inspiration for an action plan for deforestation, and this is one of the areas where we have to reflect on. But besides the objectives that I just quoted, there was a little provision in addition to other policy indication in the communication dating back to 2008, which was a study, a commitment to carry out a study to assess what was the impact of EU consumption on deforestation at global level. And the results of this study are available now online since July. It took some time to have the results of the study, but it provides quite a good overview of, in both quantitative terms and also qualitative terms, what is the EU impact on deforestation. And you have also information about other blocks. So you will see that oil palm is a problem for us in terms of consumption, but if you see the amount which are traded with China, they're much higher. So again, you see the need to work at global level. Of course, as a European Commission and EU making law body, we cannot rule and regulate for other countries. But we have to have an idea of what is our relationship in terms of weight and impact on deforestation vis-à-vis other regions and other countries. And that's something we can tackle in bilateral discussion, bilateral dialogue. As you know, of course, we negotiate in the RED arena. I have my colleague here in the public, by the way, in case you have very critical question on the RED negotiation and the EU position. We have development cooperation assistance projects targeting RED. So there are a number of actions that we are pursuing in order to reach this target of halving deforestation by 2020 and stopping by 2030. But clearly alone, the EU cannot achieve the targets. So it's very important that besides the bilateral mechanism, projects, direct assistance to countries, the flag action plan, which is focused on one commodity, we have a multilateral forum where to discuss these issues. On the study itself, I think you will see quite a lot of information. I think I provided something to the organizers, and the results and the link to the study can put also on the webpage of the conference for you to retrieve later on. To give an idea, the EU impact on deforestation in terms of consumption has been estimated at about 10%. So of all commodities which are traded worldwide and carry with them an impact in terms of deforestation, the EU consumes 10%. You can say, well, you could be happy about it. It means 90% is consumed by somebody else. We saw that a part of it is consumed regionally or nationally by the producer countries themselves. So there is a local consumption which plays a role. But if you look at the commodities which are exported, traded only, keeping away this component which is consumed locally and regionally, the impact of the EU on agriculture crops goes up to 36%. So on that, I think we have to reflect. And the food sector is the sector that accounts for 60% of the impact. So paraphrasing, we can say that we are eating tropical forest in many occasions. And I'm not sure how many people are aware that besides oil palm, there are also many other crops. I didn't hear reference to soy, for instance, today. Soy is another very important crop in terms causing an impact on deforestation and which for the EU economy and consumption plays an important role. So we are facing a huge challenge, even bigger compared to what we discussed when the flag action plan was born. Because here we have many more commodities and because trade changes. So trade is not something static. So today we make an analysis of global trade, and in 5 years' time is the same. You have huge fluctuation. You can have changes in the origin of the commodities, and this can trigger a lot of changes in the production system of the country, in the land planning, and also on prices. So one of the issues probably we should address is also when we talk about political commitment and regulation of voluntary measures. Do we want to focus on single commodity? Are we thinking about a basket of commodity? Which type of trade analysis we should use in order to follow also the changes in the market? And of course, I think the target of this panel, and we will see how the discussion goes, is besides hoping to get more political commitment, is which type of concrete actions we could put in place, starting from existing legislation and thinking about new development. I think I will stop here now. And I pass to
If you could pass the mic over to Duncan, because Duncan is our next speaker. And like Juliana, we've just had a very interesting report which you'll inform us on, and that's also on the website. So Duncan, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Just before starting on what I was going to say, it's just a brief mention of the fact that it's a shame more people aren't here, really, because I think in many ways this is the most important session, and the previous one as well, the Stream B, of the conference. Now, obviously, you think that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But the whole focus on the drivers of deforestation, on what actually causes deforestation in the first place, has been rather missed, I think, in most of the debate around REDD over the last 6 or 7 years. And the focus has been very much on the creation of global forest carbon markets as a means of delivering large amounts of financial support to developing countries. And the whole debate is kind of taking place in a vacuum at the moment, as was mentioned this morning, until we have a new climate treaty where all countries, including forest countries, have targets for reductions. So what you've seen, I think, is an awful lot of money spent on capacity building for a system that isn't going to come into place for many years to come. And in the meantime, I said we are missing the real causes of deforestation and the drivers. And I think this session and the previous one, in the focus on that, are, as I said, the most important in this conference. Anyway, having said that, what I'm aiming to do, and what I aim to do in this report here, Ending Global Deforestation, Policy Options for Consumer Countries, that was produced through Forest Trends and Chatham House, and is available on the Chatham House website. It came out just last month, is to look at the experiences we've had from controlling illegal logging and trying to exclude illegal timber from supply chains and seeing whether there are lessons we can learn for the main driver of deforestation, which, as we know, is clearance for agriculture. So Juliana told you about the EU Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Action Plan, which has helped to exclude illegal timber from consumer markets, reduce illegal logging, and improve standards of forest governance. And we've seen a series of measures employed in pursuance of those aims, of which the main ones, I think, have been public procurement policies, used by quite a wide range of countries now to require legal and sustainable timber for government contracts. Secondly, the development of voluntary partnership agreements between the EU and timber-producing countries to make sure that only legal timber is exported from those countries to the EU. And we have 6 of those agreements now in existence, with another 8 being negotiated. I think Silas will say a bit more about the experience in Liberia. And thirdly, we have a series of pieces of legislation designed to prohibit, so legal prohibition measures, making sure that anyone who trades in illegal timber is committing an illegal act wherever they are. So you have legal prohibition and due diligence systems in the EU through the EU Timber Regulation, and similar measures in the US through the Lacey Act, and Australia through the Illegal Logging Prohibition Act. And the aim of all of those measures is to exclude illegal timber from the market. And I think together with a wide range of activities in producer countries, of course what consumer countries have done is only part of the story, but together with a wide range of activities in producer countries, these have had a measurable impact on illegal logging and the trade in illegal timber. But as I said, we know that illegal logging is not the main driver of deforestation. Clearance for agriculture is far more significant, and the EU is a major importer, as Juliana said, of several agricultural commodities associated with deforestation. So, the question that this report is designed to address is whether the same measures that have been used for illegal logging could be used with effect to exclude illegal or unsustainable agricultural commodities from consumer markets, such as those in the EU. Now, I don't have much time to go through the details. There is a secondary argument that then you have to get into about whether the main target is excluding illegal commodities, which is the heart of the FLEGT mechanism for illegal logging, or whether we're aiming to exclude unsustainable or deforestation-related agricultural commodities. And there hasn't been a huge amount of focus on illegality in agricultural production so far, in comparison with the focus there was on illegal logging over the last decade or so. But work that's being carried out for Forest Trends by my colleague Sam Lawson is tending to suggest that there is a widespread illegality involved in conversion of forest to agricultural land in many tropical developing countries. And he estimates, as a very rough estimate, that something like half the tropical timber currently on the market derives from illegal conversion of agricultural land. So, having borne that, and that debate has gone into in a bit more detail in the report, bearing that in mind, what I do here is run through all the measures that have been used for illegal logging, or considered for illegal logging, and consider whether they could be used for commodities like palm oil, or soy, or beef, or cocoa. And just to summarize half of the paper, the main conclusions are, first of all, given what I just mentioned, given the prevalence on the market of timber from illegal clearance of forests for agriculture, enforcement of the FLEGT-type mechanisms, the EU Timber Regulation and the bilateral VPAs, should ensure that conversion timber is targeted. And that's not really an issue that's come up so far, but it's beginning to be talked about. Secondly, public procurement policies are increasingly being used for food, actually. There's a very wide, live debate about that in many European countries, but have mainly looked at sourcing locally sourced and organic foodstuffs. And they can and should be used for certified sustainable products. I think most obviously for palm oil and cocoa, where you have existing certification systems and also voluntary initiatives, as we heard in the last session, already underway. And in fact, the UK is now introducing such a policy for government procurement of palm oil. for food and catering. Now, again, there is a secondary argument you can get into about whether the certification systems, RSPO, RTRS, and so on, are actually adequate to stop deforestation, and that's an important issue to get into. Third conclusion, the bilateral voluntary partnership agreements, which have been used for timber, have many advantages, including their cooperative arrangements. They're not unilateral. They've helped to open up space for NGOs and civil society in the VPA partner countries to influence forest law reform. They would be quite difficult to adapt, I think, for sustainable agricultural commodities. But there may be some scope for trying to replicate some of their benefits, for example, through the UNDP sustainable commodity platforms that have been mentioned, which have attempts to try and improve governance within the supply chain. And also the so-called new generation of EU free trade agreements, of which a couple have been negotiated so far, have much broader scope than traditional free trade agreements, and are looking, among others, at promoting ethical and sustainable trade. Fourth conclusion is that legal prohibitions and due diligence legislation, like the EU timber regulation, are unlikely to be usable in the foreseeable future for unsustainable agricultural products. However, it doesn't mean to say you can't do anything. Corporate reporting of the extent to which companies are exposed to forest risk commodities, the extent to which their supply chains rely on agricultural commodities that are associated with deforestation, does have quite a lot of potential. And we have a voluntary initiative already underway there, which has been mentioned with the Forest Footprint Disclosure Project, now run by CDP, and that could perhaps be mandatory. And of course, we have seen from many examples of environmental policy that where you force or where you require companies to measure things, they start to be able to take action to control negative impacts. And then lastly, biofuels policies, subsidies for biofuels, particularly in the EU and US, clearly have a major impact on deforestation and should be adapted accordingly. So they're the main options I run through in the paper. I look at a number of other options as well, which I don't have time to talk about, including differential tariffs for sustainable and unsustainable products, labeling regulations, the role of financial institutions, and simple government support for private sector initiatives, like some of the ones we talked about in the last session. Now, I just want to emphasize the report looks at consumer country measures. This is only part of the story. Clearly, it's really important what happens in producer countries, and obviously you want the two sets of initiatives to tie up together. Voluntary initiatives on the part of industry clearly have a major role, but there is only so far you can go with both of those. And what I think the FLEGT action plan has shown is the importance of regulatory action to use consumer country buying power in the markets to steer the market towards the conclusion you want. And my final conclusion is that in the same way that the EU action plan on FLEGT helped to focus debate on the issues and to encourage people to think through the options, and there was a process of about 2 years before the action plan was, 18 months before the action plan was finalized, we could do with a similar process underway an EU action plan on sustainable agriculture, governance and trade. And that would have value in promoting discussion and coordinated action in this area. But just to finish, we need to focus on the drivers of deforestation, and any process aimed at reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, has to concentrate on that issue.
Fantastic. If you can just pass the mic to Rachel. Rachel is going to give us some real-world experience from the timber sector, and that's her background. And we're going to hear a bit more from Silas, but first to Rachel.
Thanks, Liz. I introduced myself the other day as working for the dark side, and somebody actually misheard and said, "You don't work for the dull side." Yeah. So I actually don't work for the dull side. I have been in the private sector now for a long time, but unusually I've also been in the public sector, so very often have an understanding of both sides. I think for the last however many years I've been doing this, I would always describe my role as a therapist rather than a technical advisor, because a lot of the time you are spending time with private sector guys who simply do not understand this, and it goes straight over their head. And you talk about FLEGT, and they have no clue. So I will start by saying I obviously come from the timber sector, so we see ourselves very much as a solution to deforestation, which is slightly different probably to the other commodities. And also 2 assumptions, key assumptions that I think are important to remember. Good behaviour costs money more than bad. That's clearly the issue we've been dealing with. And another assumption from a private sector perspective, all of these demand policies, and what I'm going to do is give you an overview of the experience of timber from Duncan's paper there. But they all make an assumption that the key reason you buy is for our environmental reasons. Actually, that's probably the last reason you buy. I've had countless times when I'd have buyers running up to me going, oh God, I've got this, I've got that, I've done the contract, now I need you to do that fluffy green thing. So that's kind of where you are in a lot of things. And different to what Jonathan Horrell was saying in terms of his representation, he's from a major conglomerate, retailer, etc. I think in general those guys can put their own places. What I represent is the SME level, from both the buyers and the producers. So I'm going to give a bit more of an experience from being SME level rather than a big IKEA type organisation. In terms of going through each of the demand measures, public procurement policies, Duncan and I have debated this many times. I've been involved in public procurement actually on an advisory board for the UK government, as well as being in public sector myself. My experience is, unless there's a major driver like a major KPI for these guys, whilst public procurement is a major buyer, getting around all those public procurement officers and putting a lot of resource in there is very limited impact. And that has certainly, I've had, having worked on the UK government procurement policy for timber, I had another European government come up to me very quickly and say, having seen all the money they've put into it, we're not going to bother. In terms of, I would say projects and programs, I think we've established that most people here are not private sector. There's 1 or 2 here. I was at a meeting in Bangkok about 10 days ago with a lot of institutions and NGOs. And one of the things we were very clear back is there's a lot of programs for forestry. They're basically focused on forestry. They're not actually focused on the end product. As the trade, we don't trust you. You're a complete and utter misnomer in terms of people haven't heard of IUCN. They sell timber. The lack of capacity of a lot of the traders, the SME level, is definitely there for them to engage. I'm sure Juliana will concur in many meetings on flag tea. I'm always shouting the tea is the forgotten part. There is a culture clash in how we do business. Governments sit in meetings like this for 2 days. Business will go to the bar. The clear economic benefit is never really made to them. So engagement is difficult. And often, I would say very much to the donors and the programs, they're very confusing in terms of similar objectives, who's the best one to go for. In terms of EUTR and the Timber Regulation, Lacey Act, and how they're working in terms of driving change in the private sector, I think there's 2 spectrums. There's some people who've taken it very seriously, overreacted in a lot of cases, and there's some that just sort of say, come and get me. It's too huge. I think a key for me in these regulations, I think they're absolutely key, and I was certainly part of leading the European trade to support regulation, is that level playing field. We talked a lot about price premiums in the previous. I kind of agree with the EIA there that we shouldn't be talking about price premiums. It should be the real cost of the product. I can say that there's been mixed reactions to the regulations, but one key factor for me that I think is majorly important, and it's still early days on them in terms of their impact, is very much how these messages are sold. I think that's something that's absolutely crucial. We have got many consultants, many people who don't understand these regulations, running around Europe, running around the producer countries, effectively mis-selling. Scare tactics work for short term, they don't work long term. And I think there's a real danger that if those sort of tactics are used, then the trade, when in terms of enforcement, and it doesn't happen to the level that is wanted, then there'll be a negative backlash on that. So I think for me on legislation, there has to be a very clear selling point and marketing. It's a slow implementation process and has to be done very strategically. Voluntary measures, I think we've touched a little bit on FSC, etc. previously, and certainly the timber trade has had success in this area, and some limited success, I guess. A key fact I think I want to say from the voluntary side is that for me, the trade, the private sector can't act in isolation, which is why I think processes like the FLEGT, whilst is a very slow moving machine, it's important to be part of something that's a wider issue. The timber trade can't, and the trade cannot solve all of those institutional issues. It has to be part of something much bigger. So in terms of some of the recommendations, I guess I'll sort of end on is, for me, institutions have to learn how to do business with the private sector. 2 days conferences are not their thing. It's all about, business is all about relationships, and I think Jonathan said it before. I got asked actually in a meeting 2 or 3 years ago in the EU, they said, how do we engage with the trade? I said, well, talk to them. I think that's a key thing. In terms of private sector, there's been a lot of work in civil society capacity building for SMEs, for civil society, but there's not been a lot in the private sector. We heard just the end of the last session in terms of working with small kind of forest owners, small agricultural businesses. This is key for me. In terms of going forward, as Duncan has said, and briefly on what the current situation is with RED, I think there is a clear opportunity, and this is why this session is important, of building blocks in terms of projects, looking at very simple, very easy projects of building capacity and not trying to run before we can walk. I think that's all I've got to say, and guess I can pass over to you.
Pass the mic over to Silas. Thanks very much for that. Now we're going to hear some practical experience in the south through the VPA in terms of timber, and then we can come to a wider discussion. So over to Silas.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Silas Siako. I am from Liberia. I work for a local non-governmental organization. And we, as Duncan pointed out, we've had a lot of discussion in country about how to address the problem of illegal logging. And the VPA is, I think, one of the, or I should say, the main reason for hope and the existing level of expectations that indeed it is possible that forest exploitation could benefit the people who live in and around the forest. So before I go into why I think, and I do agree that demand-side policies are important, I just want to, first of all, speak a little bit about the context in which the discussion about VPA took place in Liberia, because I think there are some important lessons to learn in terms of how different countries might want to go about whatever RED agenda they've set for themselves. First and foremost, I think it is important to bear in mind that in Liberia, so many people depend on the forest and forest resources, and the fact that the timber sector played a major role in the conflict in the country. The newly elected government at the time, this is about 6 years ago, and civil society and the international community basically agreed that there was a need to improve the way the government managed the forest. So there was a kind of a broad agreement that we needed to improve governance on the ground. Also, at the time, there were discussions just coming around about the voluntary partnership agreements. So as a part of the government's own interest in trying to chart a new course, to demonstrate to the international community that indeed it was interested in breaking with the past and charting a new course, they decided that they would embrace the voluntary partnership agreement. Civil society, on the other hand, a lot of us initially had our own hesitation about the process, but look at it as a window of opportunity that could be used to improve the way the timber companies operated and the way the government managed the resource to ensure that timber exploitation benefited the population at large. So these two interests or agendas came around together in that in order for the agenda that civil society had and the government's own agenda to be realized, there was a need to come together to collaborate and work with the European Union to see how the discussions around the voluntary partnership agreement could be structured and delivered. A final comment to make on the context is that even though the forestry legal framework, the policies, the laws, the regulations have been recently reformed, 2006, 2007, new laws, very strong provisions on the public participation, for example, equitable benefit sharing, greater transparency, etc., it soon became evident that those policies on paper didn't mean much. The government very soon began or embarked on a path that was very similar to what existed during the Taylor regime. So that, in a way, reinforced the thinking that indeed much needed to be done. And to kind of demonstrate the risks that we were running, in less than 5 years, the government had allocated more than two times illegal timber permits that were later found to be illegal, more than the permits that have been allocated through transparent and competitive bidding processes. In the original instance, we had approximately 1 million hectares that have been allocated under competitive processes, but under these illegal permits that became known as the private user permits, more than 2 million hectares have been allocated in less than 2 years. But what the VPA kind of did in a lot of different ways, it provided an opportunity and a platform for the different interest groups to come together and have a conversation about how the challenges could be addressed. And that, I think, did not happen only because the government was interested in improving the situation on the ground, but because there was a clear possibility just on the horizon that if the EU timber regulation came into force, there would be challenges for the Liberian timber industry. So that also created an incentive for the government to engage. But I should kind of point out that even though this agreement was signed in 2011, the government did not ratify it until very, very recently. So indeed, you can see that because the EU TRR came into force last year, and there is a push to get timber from Liberia certified or licensed, the government has kind of begun to, again, move ahead to try to implement the agreement. But I think there are a couple of things I need to talk about in terms of why this may be relevant for the discussions around REDD. First of all, the different stakeholders came together because there was, in a way, a shared agenda, some agreement that we needed to improve forest governance if it was to deliver for people and also for the industry and also revenue for the government. Therefore, but that has been very different from the discussions in country about REDD. It has followed a very different trajectory. And I think that may be one of the reasons why the enthusiasm around VPA has been much higher than the enthusiasm around REDD. Therefore, one of the questions that might be useful to think about is how can the interests of the different interest groups or the different stakeholders be incorporated in an inclusive RED agenda, because I think that is important in order to maintain the interest from the different actors and to provide an incentive for them to engage in the discussions around RED. But that is not necessarily an easy agenda to pursue, because ensuring that you've got broad stakeholder engagement with these discussions require much more than just a higher number of people around the table. It requires a commitment to being inclusive. It requires a commitment to disagreeing to agree. It requires a commitment to broader reforms that our individual governments would need to implement in order to improve the chances of successful implementation in our individual countries. And this is very important because, for example, in my country, one of the challenges that RED will have to deal with is the common perception or sentiment that the West has destroyed their forests, and now they are seeking to impose a mechanism on us that would limit our chances of improving our own interests, our own welfare. So there is a need to find a way to tie the local agenda to the discussions around RED. Without doing that, I think what you end up with will be a series of internationally driven projects that may not be very welcome on the ground, and therefore, after implementation, they may not be sustainable. In conclusion, one point I would like to emphasize is that without the risks that poor implementation of the forestry laws and regulations on our side, on the Liberian side, for example, could lead to an exclusion of timber from Liberia on the EU market, there was very little incentive for the government of Liberia to stop and think about doing things differently. So I think that's really important. And there is a second evidence to that which has been talked about at different times this morning. When the government was failing to implement the different laws on the books with respect to community rights to land, land tenure, etc., the RSPO, in spite of its limitations, became the only opportunity for ordinary people, for civil society, to put up a red flag and say, you've got to stop, and we need to have a discussion about how we can address some of the challenges that are emerging. So I really think from the demand side, while we may have, or while they may not be particularly sufficient, these are different policies from the demand side that aim to help improve law enforcement on the ground. They are particularly important, and they could be very useful in terms of improving federal governance on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks to all the speakers for sharing your thoughts, but actually that was the easy bit, because now you're going to get some exercise. I know everybody's feeling a bit low after quite a long day, but we're going to get some energy in the room, because we're going to stop talking, and you're going to start talking, and you're going to fire some questions at us. And if you dry up, then I've got a whole raft of them here, but I'm sure with the people in the room now, we have lots of questions to us, this particular audience, the audience to us, this particular panel. So, who's feeling brave? Okay, Tim, do you feel brave? Red tie, come
on. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, panel. I kind of really wanted to pick up on the comment that Duncan made, and it's really addressed to all of you, and I suppose in the spirit of being a little more expansive. I mean, you raised the point that this room is relatively empty, and I mean, I often see in the kind of RED world people rushing around within RED conferences and COP negotiations and stuff, really to where the money is and where the donors are, and you know, getting those RED deals signed. And I'm really wondering, to what extent red might be starving the kind of broader discussion about commodity issues, you know, of oxygen, because we have red, we have the negotiations around red. Then the point you made is that carbon is a commodity, but it's not a commodity that's kind of sorted out yet in terms of what's happening with the post, 2015 agreement. And then we have commodities, other commodities. So I guess my question is kind of wondering how you think it might be possible to re-inject all that other oxygen back into the red debate, because of course if we don't have it in the red debate, and that's the sexy policy area, you know, then we could actually, red could be quite perverse. I mean, people talk already about red being perverse, but it could be even more perverse if people are just running around after that space, and Fleg T loses, you know, its prominence, and the VPAs, and, you know, as Silas has indicated, the kind of way the VPAs worked there with their participatory nature versus red. So I hope you got a question out of that, Liz.
Small set of challenges. Okay, who's going to start? Actually, that's a good point. Could you introduce yourself in terms of getting the audience to know who's
Sorry,
asking the questions?
Tim Cadman from Griffith University in Australia.
Okay. So, who wants to start? Duncan?
Okay, well, that's a good question. I think you're right. I think the whole red debate really evolved predicated on the assumption, A, there would be a climate agreement where all countries would have targets, and then B, what was the way to deliver money to them? You had to rely on a private, a market for global forest carbon credits, because there's not enough money available in the public sector, so you had to find some way of mobilizing the private sector. But the problem is, as I said, neither of these things are happening and aren't going to happen very fast. I think, to be fair to some governments, so they are beginning to realise that. There was a mention this morning, a question to Greg Barker about the UK government's forest and climate change programme, which is about half of the money it's set aside within its International Climate Fund for forests. Now, originally, that was going to be spent on, it was actually called the UK RED programme. I may not be meant to tell you that, so don't tell anybody else that. It's changed now, and the focus
Live
of
streaming.
it is very much now on working with producer country governments on the drivers of deforestation, and there'll be some elements of work on consumer country measures as well. At least there will be if the government ever manages finally to design the programme and get it going, which we hope might happen sometime in the next year/decade. So I think I think there is a gradual realisation among governments like that really the traditional red agenda as it's developed isn't delivering a huge amount. I think the other problem, people more familiar with the red negotiations in the UNFCCC can probably comment on this more than I can, but I mean there is a mention of drivers in the various documents that are debated, but that is a really controversial topic for many climate negotiators from developing countries, because they see it as about trade, the use of trade, and effectively erecting barriers to their exports, which is the kind of question that bedevils a lot of international negotiations. Now, it's something we've managed to avoid in the general international discussion about forest law enforcement and illegal logging. I think, and the emphasis was very much always from the start on countries working together, and the realisation that everybody wanted illegal timber to be kept off the market. And I think the whole agenda has benefited enormously from that. And if we can create that kind of space where this is seen as a collaborative, cooperative effort to basically increase the returns to developing countries by promoting sustainable agriculture, by the kind of things that Darryl was talking about in the last session, by reducing the costs of agriculture, by making it more sustainable, and by securing supplies for the long term, then I think perhaps we have the chance to create that kind of debate again. But I can't see it really happening under the UNFCCC. I think we have to open up some kind of additional space for it. And it's good that at least this Red Exchange has this session and the previous session on it, which I think they didn't 2 years ago. Sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying I'm not quite sure, but I have some ideas.
Anyone else want to take that? Julia?
But just to build on what Duncan said, I think I'm also not a red negotiator, so I don't have the details, as many of you probably have. But let's say a weak point is that I see that the drivers of deforestation are not really prominent on the agenda of the negotiators. They are treated in technical discussion or in mitigation at country strategy level. So it's quite clear that they are seen as a parallel discussion that should be taken in other fora. And probably, as Duncan said, it could be the case that we use other fora, like the first that comes to my mind is the discussion on the Rio+20 process and the post-2015 process that will be quite active next year, where there will be discussion on the new Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, a combination of the two streams of targets. That's, again, it's a huge multilateral negotiation that can be either conducive to something or just a major political display of good intentions, but we should not get discouraged. It could be a parallel stream that we use to negotiate multilaterally.
Okay, anyone else? Rachel? Right. Okay.
You won't let me use yours? Okay. Okay. No, I think I just reiterate, I think there's got to be some pragmatic action. RED, to me and most people that I know, I'm in the FLAG-T world, probably more, it's nebulous up here. But it has an opportunity in terms of the carbon, because one of the major opportunities for timber is green building. And capturing that is a key, but linking that to that on the ground, it's not been done so. And I think the other issue is about doing small scale and selling this message that actually doing due diligence, doing the commodity supply chains is good business. That's a key thing.
Okay, and I can also add, there is a major problem with voluntary certification, which is the area that we've all heard about today, which is how do you get to the millions of smallholders that are involved in this process. And right now there isn't a very convincing answer as to how that's going to happen. There are some leading edge companies who are putting money in, but they're at project level. So it isn't a major rollout opportunity. So if we're actually to look at merging the voluntary and the not so voluntary agendas, that is a major opportunity area. We also have the set aside and the mitigation aspects of becoming compliant, which for many organizations are challenging, and actually creating an intrinsic worth in the set-aside areas is something to think about, and that's certainly for the voluntary certification movement. The whole issue of carbon and carbon management within agriculture is an area that they're beginning to explore, but there is a crossover space, and one that seriously needs some resources. So that's something to do with all this money that's sloshing around in projects. And that's maybe something to think about, because we can't get mainstreaming without a business case. And right now the business case is extremely poor for some of the